Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Paul Reber, the new director of Stratford Hall, and let me say I'm pleased to be back in Virginia, and I'm especially pleased to be here at Stratford. I know that many of you here today are longtime supporters, and I appreciate your involvement and for being with us here. And I look forward to getting to know you today in the weeks and the months to come. This is the third of these lectures that I've been able to attend and have found them extremely helpful and informative. I just returned last week from the annual meeting of the Organization of American Historians, which reminded me how important this lecture series is. One of the sessions I attended was entitled White Knight and Drunken Butcher, Robert E. Lee and U.S. Grant in American Memory. I don't think I need to remind this audience who was the White Knight and who was the Drunken Butcher. The presenters were representatives from the National Park Service who were responsible for telling the stories of these two men at Arlington House, the Grant Farm in St. Louis, and at Appomattox Courthouse. It was fascinating to hear how these sites are still dealing with visitors who largely believe these descriptions of Lee and Grant as Knight and Butcher. Of course, their true characters were much more complex, as we have learned about Lee here over the past few months. I want to express my appreciation to the Lee Jackson Educational Foundation for their support of this series, and also to Ken McFarland from our staff for his outstanding job of putting this lecture series together. And I'm going to turn the podium over to Ken to introduce our speaker today. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to the podium for the first time in that capacity that I'm aware of anyway. And it is a great pleasure to have been involved with this series and to get to know some of the people in the audience a little better than I had before, and some of you just brand new and fresh. And thus it's my pleasure to welcome you back today, and it's certainly my honor and pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Professor William C. Davis, who is going to address the topic Partners in Command, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. I was telling Professor Davis before the lecture that we've received questions about the relationship between Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee throughout the previous lectures, and now everybody who's asked those questions will have a chance to perhaps hear the questions answered during the lecture, and if not, in the aftermath, to ask them again. Just a couple of little items of business I will mention before I begin the formal introduction. If you do have a cell phone, we do ask that you turn it off. As a matter of fact, I just discovered mine was on and turned it off very faithfully. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we will have questions in the aftermath of the lecture, and our speaker will be addressing those probably for about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on what time his talk actually formally concludes. And then in the aftermath of that, as we've done before, we'll be going to our visitor center, the Preservation Gallery, where there'll be a reception and a book signing. We do have several of Professor Davis's books on sale here, including The Cause Lost and also Look Away. And some of you, I believe, have brought your own copies of either these books or others that you'd like for him to sign. I'm sure he'd be more than pleased to do so. William Davis has been at Virginia Tech now since the year 2000. He came in August, the same year I came to Stratford, we discovered, as we were discussing, where he is professor of history and also director of programs at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. And that probably rings the bell for those of you who are familiar with our first speaker, Professor James Robertson, because they have parallel careers there in both being professors at Virginia Tech and also being employed at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. Professor Davis is originally from Independence, and I promised him I would pronounce it correctly, Missouri. And he has his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Sonoma State College, then is now University, and a Doctor of Humane Letters from Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee. Again, as many of you know, he has spent much of his career in the publishing industry, and I was trying to imagine a library of any sort, public, university, or even private library, that doesn't contain a number of books that he's written or that he has submitted essays to or that he has edited. It's absolutely amazing. I think he is arguably, beyond argument really, the most prolific author in the field of Civil War studies in America today. And therefore, I guess that would mean in the entire world. He also has taught and lectured at a number of colleges and universities, such as Penn State, Auburn, Gettysburg College, just to name several. I won't even begin to run through the names of all of his publications. I couldn't do it. He's published, I believe, over 40 books, and he's continuing to work away at that task, and including beginning in 1975, the book Breckinridge, Statesman, Soldier, Symbol, which was published by LSU Press and received a Pulitzer Prize nomination. He's published other books, such as The Battle of New Market, Duel Between the First Ironclads, Battle of Bull Run, etc., etc., etc. My first major awareness of Professor Davis, and maybe for some of you, was the Image of War series, the first volume of which came out in 1981. And I just remember being terribly impressed by it. I was actually working part-time at the Inwood Bookshop in Chapel Hill when it came out. And I thought, this is really a step beyond anything I've seen thus far. Other works he's written and been published: Jefferson Davis, The Man in His Hour, The Cause Lost, which I just showed you, we have available for sale today. Look Away, A History of the Confederate States Government. He's also consulted extensively for film and television productions, working with the Arts and Entertainment Network, the History Channel, the BBC, ABC, and he has a list of awards and honors that go on as long as his list of publications. I mentioned the one Pulitzer nomination. He's also been nominated for the Battle of Bull Run. He received the Jules F. Landry Award for Best Book in Southern History for his Breckinridge, Statesman, Soldier, and Symbol. He also received the Belle I. Wiley Prize from the National Historical Society for his book on Jefferson Davis, and the Laney Prize for The Cause Lost. His interests also go beyond the Civil War and encompass Texas history, and writes to his recent book, Three Roads to the Alamo, The Lives and Fortunes of David Crockett, James Bowie, and William Barrett Travis, has been sold just recently to a motion picture production company. So this indeed is the Renaissance men of the Civil War, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome today Professor William C. Davis, speaking on Partners in Command, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee.
The question is related to the Ken Burns series. There were a lot of questions about and complaints about accuracy in it when it first came out, I think in 1990 or 91. And did Bud Robertson and I address any of that in this abortive introduction to the court? We didn't address anything. We sat there in silence for the whole hour. Weren't you listening? But no, in fact, we didn't. And you may not believe this, but I'll tell you this anyhow. I couldn't have anyhow because I never saw the Ken Burns series. I make it a point not to see anything about the Civil War, including God knows how many hours of Civil War Journal that I did. If it's in the evening, that's my time. I don't want to watch Civil War. I want to watch Daffy Duck cartoons or something. So I couldn't address how accurate it was or was not anyhow. I can only say, though, that for whatever problems it had, and the other reason I really don't watch Civil War things is because it's impossible not to fall into the trap of looking for mistakes. And every human endeavor's got them. No matter how hard I work on my books, as soon as the first copy arrives, and it falls flat on the floor, and my eyes go right to a big gaffe. And I don't think it's fair to the producer or to the writers to go looking for them because you're bound to find them. It represents a best effort. But regardless of how flawed it may have been, it did wonderful missionary work by making millions of people more aware of it and developing an interest in it. Some of that has waned. That always happens with any fan. But I think the fact that interest in the Civil War era, and history sort of always, in general, gets to tag along with interest in the Civil War. The fact that it's where it is today, still riding a fairly high plateau, I think owes a fair bit to the Ken Burns series. But I'm sure there are mistakes in it. Yes, sir, back there.
Professor Davis, you indicated that you really don't know a whole lot about what Lee thought about Davis. Immediately, one quote comes to my mind. I don't know if it was in the Flood book, Lee in the Later Years, or if it was Duty, Faith, and Reform. But there was a comment where Lee said that he didn't know of anyone in the South that could have done a better job than Davis, and he knew very few that could have done as good a job.
The question was relating to Lee's opinions of Davis. The gentleman seems to recall in Charles Braceland's Flood's book, Lee's Later Years, there's a comment attributed to Lee that he didn't know of anyone in the South who could have done a better job as a Confederate leader than Davis. I'm aware of that quote, but I'm not sure I trust the source it came from. And not Flood, but where he got it. I can't now recall where that came from. It may have been from one of those interviews that Lee gave to William Allen in 1867 or 68, in which Lee is actually somewhat critical of Longstreet and a couple of other people. But I can't recall for sure. But I'd second it. I see no reason why Lee wouldn't have felt that way. Because when you look at what was available in the political pool in the South, who were logically available candidates to be president, no one stands out. Part of the reason the nation came to a civil war in the first place is because we were in a real low period when it came to political leadership, something that we've all had experience with from time to time since then. And, it's just a miracle that someone with Lincoln's unexpected abilities rose to the top. But there was no reason to suspect Lincoln had that. You realize if Davis had not been elected president of the Confederacy, the next most likely candidate was Charles Conrad of Louisiana. Hands up everybody who's heard of Charles Conrad. It was a real low point in statesmanship. And for all of his faults as a manager, and Davis, as I said at the beginning, was a great bureaucrat. Well, great bureaucrats rarely make good executives. And vice versa, by the way. It's not a value judgment between them, but it's two different kinds of mindset. Lincoln was a great executive. He couldn't run a simple country store, but he could run Microsoft today because he understood how to think corporately. But Davis, I can't think of anyone else who could have done as good a job as Davis did, given what he had to work with. He, of course, always starts with a mark against him because he lost. And the presumption under the question of who could do better than Davis always carries with it implicitly the statement, who could have made the Confederacy win? God. There's a question over here.
Between Lee and Davis, who do you believe was the primary mover for the second invasion of the North?
Between Lee and Davis, who was the primary mover for the second invasion of the North? You're speaking of Gettysburg, right? Lee. I think that's Lee's campaign all the way. Because again, Davis is on record as expressing some reservations about it, but he's willing to set them aside because he has this implicit trust and confidence in Lee. Yes, sir, right here.
President Lincoln had his Hallecks, his McClellans, and finally Grant. But with this remarkable collaboration between Lee and Davis, why wasn't Lee ever made Commander General of all the armies?
The question is, with this great relationship, with the great relationship between Lee and Davis, why wasn't he made General-in-Chief of all the armies? Well, of course, he is very briefly, theoretically, in early 1862, and then it's January or February, I think the legislation's in January of 1865, Lee becomes General-in-Chief of Confederate armies again, by which point it's so what? The question would come up from time to time, but the problem with that position was with creating an office of General-in-Chief with some real teeth to it, was that it represented a reduction in Jefferson Davis's control. And as I said, Davis was at heart a bureaucrat, and a bureaucrat likes to have control of everything, and it's tough to delegate. Even with Lee, maybe it was tough for Davis to delegate. And in fact, at the end, I think part of the reason that Davis was willing to go along with the General-in-Chief legislation was because it then handed Davis's problems with Beauregard and Johnston over to Lee. He would have to deal with them. And he also realized that maybe Lee and Johnston, as fellow Virginians, might craft some kind of better relationship than Davis had ever been able to with Johnston. Yes, sir, right behind him.
Curious. About Davis. After the collapse, was Lee expecting to be tried for treason along with other senior officers like Secretary of the Navy and the Army? Did he keep any kind of record of his thoughts after the war?
The question is, after the collapse, when Lee, of course, simply goes home, was he expecting to be tried for treason, since he's under indictment, as are most of the civil leaders of the Confederacy and a number of the high-ranking Army leaders? And did he leave any thoughts about his feelings on this? None of them knew what to expect, which is why the end of the Civil War sees the largest mass expatriation movement in our history. Somewhere around 10,000 Confederates leave the country. Now, not all of them are under indictment. Many simply refuse to live in a reunited union. You know, they go all over the world. Most of them eventually will come back home. Some do flee for fear of their lives, because this has never happened before, and they know what the penalty for treason can be. Whether or not they reasonably expected that they would be tried and executed or have some other kind of infringements of their rights or their liberties imposed upon them, I don't know. Lee did what most, in fact, did. He simply went home to wait to see what happened. But again, I think it speaks to his character, his understanding the Confederacy is dead, it is lost. We are now once again a part of the old civil democracy, and let the processes of law take their course. I think Lee was perfectly willing to accept the consequences. He felt he had nothing to apologize for. If he wrote anything about this, I'm not aware of it, but I've not studied Lee post-war. There was one other hand back here. Yes, ma'am.
At any time in their correspondence, when did Davis admit to Lee or Lee admit to Davis or indicate that their cause was dying, and what was the opposite's reaction?
At what point in their correspondence did either indicate to the other a belief that the cause was lost? Never. Davis simply never admitted it at all. Even when Davis was when Richmond had fallen, when Lee had surrendered, when Davis and remnants of his cabinet are fleeing south through North Carolina, then South Carolina into Georgia, Davis has entered a kind of delusional twilight land at times, in which he starts talking to the people in his escort about how they'll ride west across the Deep South. Bedford Forrest's command will join them. Ghostly armies of tens of thousands of the deserters and the disloyal and released prisoners and escaped prisoners and slaves and heavenly hosts will somehow come out of the mountains. People who weren't willing to fight for 4 years will suddenly be inspirited, rally to their banners, and they'll cross the Mississippi by walking on it, apparently, since they have no control of it now. And maybe they'll retreat to Colorado or to Texas or into Mexico and come back to fight again. This sounds delusional, I know. I'm not making fun of him. I know it sounds like it. Davis, I'm convinced, Davis is a man who had 4 sons and outlived all of them. The Confederacy is Davis's creation as much as any of those sons. I think it was simply not possible for him to wrap his mind around the idea that he could oversee the death of this other child. And so he will become, he'll lapse from reality to delusion to reality again. And he never accepts it until the very end. I think Lee understood probably by easily by January of '65, that the game was up. And indeed, in March of '65, it's not widely known, but Lee will participate in a few meetings with a few members of Congress and with the new Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, in meetings designed, these are quite out in the open, this is no conspiracy or cabal, designed to try to put in front of the President information to make it evident to him that the Confederate Army no longer has the wherewithal to continue to resist. And so all the Bureau of the War Department will turn in reports from the quartermaster and the commissary and the commissary general of prisoners and the conscription and all of the branches of the War Department, designed to show how they can't go on, and that this would be put in front of the President, brought onto the floor of Congress by the members of Congress who were in this group meeting, and that Lee will nod in assent that he thinks he can no longer proceed, and that somehow they think this will persuade Davis to give up. But Davis outfoxes all of them by short-circuiting it before it ever gets to Congress. And then at some point, Lee withdraws from those meetings. We know very little about this. And I don't know why, though I'm guessing it is that as the spring campaigns are approaching, he probably couldn't quit without giving it one more try. Thank you all very much for listening.